She had never once looked at the man who cleaned her floors. Not really. He was part of the building. The same way the marble columns and the elevator buttons were part of the building. Functional, unremarkable, invisible. Until the morning he handed her a cup of coffee with the steady hands of someone who had never needed anything from anyone. And she found herself unable to look away. That was the beginning. She didn't know it yet. Victoria Calloway ran Calloway Capital from the 42nd floor of a glass tower in downtown Chicago, and she ran it the way she ran everything else in her life, with absolute precision and zero tolerance for inefficiency. She was 36 years old. She had founded the firm at 29, with a seed investment from 2 former professors, and a business plan she'd revised 47 times before she let a single other person read it. She had been called ruthless by journalists who admired her, and worse by rivals who didn't. She considered both descriptions, compliments. Her mornings followed a structure so rigid, it functioned less like a routine and more like a religion. 6:15, a 40-minute run along the lakefront, regardless of weather. 7:30, a protein breakfast eaten standing at her kitchen island while reviewing overnight reports on her tablet. 8:45, arrival at the office. Her driver, a quiet man named Terrence, had never once been late. Neither had she. The office itself reflected her philosophy. No clutter, no sentiment. A single framed photograph on her desk, not of family, not of a milestone, but of the Chicago skyline taken from the roof of this building on the night she signed the lease. A reminder, she told interviewers, of what ambition looked like from the outside. It looked like spreadsheets and board calls, and the particular brand of loneliness that came from being the smartest person in most of the rooms you walked into. She didn't complain about any of it. She had chosen it. Her executive assistant, a meticulous young woman named Diane, managed Victoria's calendar with the reverence of someone tending a sacred text. No meeting lasted longer than it was scheduled to. No appointment was made without a clear agenda. Victoria had canceled 2 dates in the past year and hadn't rescheduled either. The men in question had sent polite messages. She had read them with the distant fondness of someone reviewing a closed case file. She was not unkind. She was simply efficient. There was a difference, though she had long since stopped explaining it. Calloway Capital occupied 12 floors of the tower. The building's maintenance staff, the people who kept those floors clean, who replaced the burnt-out lights and buffed the lobby floors to their mirror shine, existed in the peripheral vision of everyone who worked there, acknowledged only when something went wrong. Victoria was aware of this the way she was aware of most things. She had no intention of changing. It was simply how buildings worked. She knew the head of building services by name, a heavy-set man named Roland, who nodded at her in elevators and occasionally left handwritten notes about scheduled maintenance. She did not know the names of the people who reported to him. One of those people was Nathan Hale. He was 39, though he looked younger in some lights and considerably older in others. He was tall, with the kind of build that suggested he had once been an athlete and had since traded muscle mass for something quieter and more sustainable. His maintenance uniform, the gray collared shirt and dark pants standard issue across the building, fit him with a neatness that other staff members rarely achieved. He wore it, Victoria would later observe, like a man who had decided to wear it, rather than a man who had simply been given it. He had been working the morning shift at Calloway Capital's floors for 11 months. He arrived before most employees and left before most department heads. He was good at his job, in the methodical, unhurried way that professionals are good at things not because they're trying to impress anyone, but because they've internalized a standard for themselves that has nothing to do with being watched. His daughter was 7 years old. Her name was Rosie. She had a gap-toothed smile and an obsession with marine biology that Nathan indulged without limit, keeping a rotating stack of library books on the subject piled beside her bed. He dropped her at school each morning at 7:40, which gave him exactly 32 minutes to catch the express bus to the tower and be at his station by 8:15. He had never been late. He was also, though no one in this building knew it, the former chief operating officer of one of the most successful financial technology startups in the country. But that was a different life. He had closed the door on it carefully, with both hands, and he did not intend to open it again. It was a Tuesday in November. The kind of day that announces winter without any particular drama, flat gray sky, a wind off the lake that moved through coat collars with casual cruelty. Victoria arrived at the office at 8:20, which was 25 minutes earlier than usual. She had a 9 o'clock call with a European investor group that had been rescheduled 3 times and could not, under any circumstances, be rescheduled again. She needed the quarterly projection files printed, bound, and on her desk before the call, and she needed coffee. She stepped out of the elevator onto the 42nd floor and found the reception area empty. Diane didn't arrive until 8:40. The kitchen staff, a small catering team managed through the building, didn't begin setup until the same time. Victoria stood in the quiet of the executive floor for a moment, doing a private accounting of her options. She could go back down to the lobby cafe. She could wait. She could do without, which was not something she was prepared to do before a 9 o'clock call with the Bauman Group. She walked toward the staff kitchen at the far end of the floor and found the lights already on. Nathan was at the sink, rinsing out a mop bucket. He looked up when she came in, not with the startled, apologetic expression that most staff members wore when caught unexpectedly in proximity to her, but with something closer to mild interest, as though he'd been expecting someone to walk through the door, and she was simply the person it turned out to be. "Miss Calloway," he said, with a brief nod, and went back to what he was doing. She looked at the coffee station. The machine was high-end, a commercial espresso unit she'd had installed herself, operated usually by a catering staff member who knew its settings. She could operate it. She had done so in emergencies. But the process took time, and she was already calculating the margins. "Do you know how to use that machine?" she asked. He finished rinsing the bucket, set it aside, and dried his hands on a small folded cloth he produced from his back pocket. He looked at the machine. Then he said, "Yes, not I think so or I can try. Just yes. Double espresso," she said. He didn't write it down. He moved to the machine with an ease that made her pause, not hurried, not performed. He opened the grinder, assessed the bean level, filled it with a portion she could tell was measured by feel rather than guesswork. He tamped the grounds with a pressure that was, she noted, more precise than the catering staff usually managed. The machine hummed. Steam moved through the group head. She watched him without intending to. He had clean hands. That was the first thing she noticed. Not the uniform, not his height, not the quiet authority of his movements, but the fact that his hands were clean in a way that said he cared about them. There was a small scar across the knuckle of his right index finger. She had no idea why she noticed that. The espresso came out dark and even. He placed the cup on a small saucer, locating both items without searching, as though he knew this kitchen, and set it on the counter in front of her. No flourish, no attempt at a smile. She took a sip before she spoke. "It was excellent." She did not say so. "You've worked this floor for almost a year," she said. It wasn't quite a question. 11 months, he said. "I don't know your name." A brief pause. Not discomfort, more like consideration. "Nathan," he said. "Do you have a last name, Nathan?" "Hale." She set the cup down. "The quarterly files need to be on my desk before 9. I'm going to need someone to locate them in the print room. Diane isn't in yet." "Room 4207, he said. The print queue ran overnight. The bound copies should be in the output tray. She looked at him. "I saw the print request on the queue board when I was cleaning the copy room at 6:30, he said, answering the unasked question. "And you retained that?" "I retain most things." She picked up the cup again and studied him over the rim. There was a quality to his stillness that she recognized, the compressed attentiveness of someone listening for something specific in a room full of noise. She had developed the same quality herself over years of managing rooms full of competing interests. "I'll get the files myself," she said. She took the coffee and walked out. The files were exactly where he said they would be. The interaction lasted maybe 8 minutes. It should have been unremarkable. Victoria had brief exchanges with dozens of people every day that left no trace in her memory by afternoon. This one stayed. She couldn't have said precisely why, which bothered her in the low-level, persistent way that unsolved problems tended to bother her. She was not a woman who spent time on impressions. She was a woman who spent time on facts. The facts, as she reviewed them over the following days, were modest. A maintenance employee who knew how to operate an espresso machine. A maintenance employee who had noted the contents of the print queue. Neither of these things was particularly significant. People knew things. People paid attention. It was not, by itself, evidence of anything. And yet, on Thursday of that week, she was on a call in her corner office when she saw Nathan through the glass partition, cleaning the corridor outside. He had his phone pressed between his shoulder and ear, an awkward posture she would have expected to produce a slumped, distracted quality in his work. Instead, his movements with the mop were as methodical as always, and he was speaking in a low, precise tone she couldn't quite hear. She watched him for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she returned her attention to the call. Friday afternoon, she was leaving for an early departure when she passed the small break room adjacent to the service elevator. The door was half open. She slowed almost involuntarily and saw Nathan sitting at the small table, a cup of coffee cooling beside him, reading. She caught a glimpse of the open document before he closed the folder, not a novel, not a news site. The letterhead was from a legal firm. The font was dense, contract grade. She walked past. On Monday, she asked Diane obliquely, without particular emphasis, about the maintenance staff's background check procedures. Building management handles all of that, Diane said. Standard screening, I assume. Why? No reason, Victoria said. I want to review the protocol at some point. Diane made a note. She always made notes. Victoria ran the name through the firm's own background service that afternoon, Nathan Hale. The results were clean and almost entirely bare. No criminal record. Previous employer, listed as a small facilities management company in Milwaukee. Education, associate's degree, vocational track. The file was consistent, coherent, and offered nothing to explain the quiet confidence of a man who could discuss the print queue's overnight run at 6:30 in the morning with the casual retention of someone who organized information for a living. She closed the file, decided she was overthinking it. Then, on Wednesday, she was in the lobby when she saw an incident she was not meant to see. One of her junior analysts, a 25-year-old named Brandon Whitfield, who had the institutional arrogance of a man promoted too quickly, had apparently asked Nathan to move a cart that was blocking service entrance. The request, from the fragment Victoria caught as she crossed the lobby, had not been phrased as a request. Standing here for 20 minutes, I shouldn't have to ask twice. Nathan was looking at Brandon with an expression of complete equanimity. Not wounded, not resentful, just waiting. It'll be moved in about 3 minutes, Nathan said. I'm waiting for the delivery team to clear the hallway so I can bring it through without a second obstruction. I don't need the logistics, Brandon said. I just need it moved. I know, Nathan said simply. 3 minutes. Brandon made a sound of exasperated dismissal and walked away. Nathan watched him go with the mild patience of someone who has had this exact conversation many times and has long since stopped taking it personally. Victoria had paused near the column on the far side of the lobby. Nathan turned and saw her. For a fraction of a second, something passed between them, not quite acknowledgement, not quite understanding. Then he returned to the cart. She continued to the elevator bank. She did not stop thinking about it for the rest of the afternoon. The following week, Rosie was sick. Victoria didn't know this. She wouldn't have known it at all if she hadn't arrived early again. A different kind of early this time. Not the structured precision of the previous Tuesday, but the aimless. Too many thoughts at 3 a.m. Kind of early that she rarely admitted to. She was in the kitchen by 7:50, and Nathan was there before her, which meant he had arrived before his shift. He was on the phone. He didn't hang up when she walked in. She's not running a fever anymore. But I don't want her going back until Thursday at the earliest, he was saying. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before, softer, with a particular kind of focus that wasn't about information management, but about something more immediate. Can you stay until I'm done at 4? I'll cover the difference in rate. A pause. He listened. I know. I'm sorry to ask. Thank you, Janet. He ended the call and looked at Victoria. No embarrassment. No performance of apology. Daughter, she said. 7 years old, he said. She had a fever for 2 days. It broke last night. She moved to the coffee machine. This time, she operated it herself. She was aware, without wanting to be, of the small recalibration this information produced: a 7-year-old daughter with a broken fever, a father who was covering the difference in his sitter's rate, a man standing in a utility kitchen at 7:50 in the morning having arrived early, because arriving late was not a category that existed for him. "How long has it been the two of you?" she asked. She wasn't entirely sure why she asked. 4 years, he said. He was filling out a maintenance log on a clipboard. Since she was 3, that's a long time. It's her whole life, the way she remembers it, he said. So it doesn't feel long from her end. Victoria said nothing for a moment. Then, "What does she want to be?" He smiled. It was the first smile she had seen from him, and it had the effect of changing the geometry of his face, entirely suddenly readable, warm, and entirely unguarded. "Marine biologist," he said. "Specifically, she wants to study the migratory patterns of humpback whales. She will be happy to explain the difference between humpback and blue whale migration in considerable detail if you give her the opportunity." "How do you know about migratory patterns of humpback whales?" "I've read everything she's brought home," he said simply. "She quizzes me." Victoria took her coffee and left. She thought about that smile for the rest of the day. She also thought, in the less examined part of her mind, about the arithmetic of his morning. He had arrived early because his sitter needed extra notice. He had called Janet, whoever Janet was, a neighbor perhaps, or a retired woman 2 floors down in his building, the kind of steady peripheral support that single parents quietly assembled and were never quite publicly credited for, and arranged coverage, and apologized for the imposition, and thanked her in a way that meant it. All of this before 8 in the morning, on the same day his daughter's fever had broken. In the same voice, he used to coordinate maintenance schedules with the building safety team. She had spent years building operational systems for a living. She recognized someone who had done the same thing for a life. 2 days later, she saw him in the corridor outside the service elevator with what appeared to be a hand-drawn map. She slowed involuntarily. The map was on a piece of notebook paper, clearly drawn by a child Rosie's work. She intuited, without knowing why she was so certain. It showed what appeared to be the floor plan of the building's 42nd level, with rooms labeled in large, careful capital letters. Service room. Coffee place. Big lady's office. She was reading it upside down. She stopped reading. Nathan had not seen her. He folded the map carefully twice, then once more, and slid it into his breast pocket. Not because he needed it, because it had been given to him. She continued down the corridor and said nothing about what she had seen to anyone for a long time. The crisis arrived on a Thursday afternoon in December, which was, in retrospect, exactly the wrong time for a crisis, given that the Callaway Capital Board meeting was scheduled for the following Monday, and 3 of their core portfolio companies were mid-round. It came in the form of a message from the firm's compliance officer, a meticulous 48-year-old named Gerald Schiff, delivered to Victoria's desk at 2:17 in the language of a man who had been holding something in for approximately 4 hours before deciding he could no longer do so. The short version. A preliminary SEC inquiry had been opened into Meridian Analytics, one of Callaway Capital's highest-profile holdings. The specific concern was around the accuracy of reported user data in Meridian's most recent investor materials that Callaway had co-authored. The inquiry was preliminary, which meant it wasn't catastrophic. Yet, by 3 o'clock, Victoria's conference room contained Gerald, 2 outside counsel attorneys from Hargrove and Finch, her head of investor relations, and Diane, who was taking notes with the controlled intensity of someone diffusing a device. By 4 o'clock, the shape of the problem was clear. Meridian's founders had used a methodology for counting active users that was, depending on your definition of the word aggressive, either a gray area accounting decision or a disclosure failure. The attorneys were in the middle of explaining the spectrum of outcomes when the fire alarm went off on the floor below and produced a brief, disorienting evacuation sequence that ended with everyone gathered in the lobby while the building's maintenance staff confirmed a false trigger from a malfunctioning smoke sensor in one of the lower floor kitchens. In the lobby, while Diane fielded calls and the attorneys huddled over a laptop, Victoria found herself standing near the service desk, coat on, not thinking about anything in particular. Nathan was nearby, coordinating with the building's safety officer on the sensor issue. He was on his radio, precise and calm. She didn't intend to speak to him. She heard herself say, "If a portfolio company misrepresented user metrics in co-authored materials, and the misrepresentation can be characterized as a methodology question rather than a fraud question, what's the exposure window for the co-author?" She had no idea why she was asking a janitor this question. He looked at her for a moment. Then, without hesitation, "It depends on whether the co-author had independent visibility into the methodology. If you were working from numbers the company supplied without a disclosure of how those numbers were derived, the exposure is significantly narrower. The question the regulators will ask is what you knew and when you knew it, not what the methodology was." The lobby was loud with the low roar of an evacuated floor. No one was near enough to hear them, and if the attorneys recommend a proactive disclosure to limit exposure, that's almost always the right call when it's genuinely preliminary, he said. Voluntary disclosure in the early window shows cooperation and limits the narrative the investigation can build around concealment. The cost is the disclosure itself. The cost of waiting is control of the story. Victoria stared at him. She said carefully, "How do you know that?" He said nothing for a moment. Then, "I've read a lot." The all clear came over the building's intercom. People began moving toward the elevators. Nathan picked up his radio and turned back to the safety officer. Victoria stood in the lobby for another moment before she moved. She did not go back to the meeting immediately. She went to her office, closed the door, and opened a different browser, the one she used for research. She didn't want routed through the firm's standard search tools. She searched Nathan Hale. The name was common enough that the first several pages produced nothing of relevance. She narrowed it. Nathan Hale FinTech. Nathan Hale Coup. Nathan Hale Financial Technology. On the fourth search, she found him. It was a trade publication profile from 6 years ago, behind a partial paywall but with enough preview text to confirm what she was already beginning to understand. The headline, "The Quiet Engine. Inside Harbridge Financial's Operational Rise." The photo accompanying the article was smaller than her thumb on screen, but the face was recognizable. She paid for the full article. Nathan Hale had been Chief Operating Officer of Harbridge Financial Technologies from its Series A funding round through its acquisition by a larger payments platform. He had joined the company at 29, built their operational infrastructure from the ground up, and managed the due diligence process during a $340 million acquisition that the article described as one of the cleanest M&A transactions in the sector's history. Industry sources quoted described him variously as quietly brilliant, the most methodical person I've ever watched build a company, and, from one anonymous competitor, the person you most didn't want on the other side of a negotiation. The acquisition had closed when he was 33. Rosie would have been 3. She searched for what came after. It took longer. There was a gap, not suspicious in itself, but notable. A few mentions in passing in pieces about former Harbridge employees, then a brief notice in a Chicago business publication 2.5 years ago. Nathan Hale, formerly of Harbridge Financial, had been named as a named defendant in a civil lawsuit filed by Harbridge's former CEO, a man named Clifford Hurst. The suit alleged misappropriation of proprietary data during the transition period following the acquisition. She read the lawsuit summary twice. Then she pulled the court records. The case had been dismissed 14 months after filing. Insufficient evidence, but the filing itself, the public, searchable, industry gossip circulating filing, had coincided almost exactly with the gap in Nathan's professional record. She sat with that for a long time. A man who had built one of the decade's cleanest acquisitions, who had been described by everyone who worked with him as meticulous and incorruptible, accused by a disgruntled, former superior of conduct that everyone who knew the facts had ultimately found groundless. A man with a 3-year-old daughter and no appetite. it seemed. For the kind of prolonged public fight that clears a name and costs a childhood. A man who had taken a maintenance job and come to work on time every day for 11 months. She closed the browser, sat in the silence of her 42nd floor office. Outside the windows, the lake was gray and cold and entirely indifferent. She thought, he chose this. She thought, he chose it for Rosie. She found him the following morning before anyone else arrived. He was in the kitchen again. He turned when she walked in, and something in his expression, the way his posture changed by almost nothing, a millimeter of recalibration told her that he had been expecting this conversation for some time. Perhaps since the lobby, perhaps before that. She sat down at the small kitchen table, which was not something she had ever done. She put her coffee on the table and looked at him directly and said, "Harbridge, Financial." He was quiet for a moment. Then he sat down across from her. He did not waste time on confusion or performance. He simply waited to hear what else she would say. The Hearst lawsuit was baseless, she said. The dismissal was unambiguous. Yes, he said, but the filing was enough. It was enough, he said, to make building anything else feel like a decision I would be making for myself and not for Rosie. He looked at his hands for a moment. She was 3. She didn't understand why her father was on the phone for 16 hours a day talking to lawyers. She didn't understand why we moved, or why I was distracted and short-tempered for most of a year. He looked up. After the dismissal, I had offers. Several of them, good ones, but they were all versions of the same thing, the same world, the same exposure, the same possibility that someone with a grievance could create 6 months of chaos in her life with a filing. Victoria said nothing. "I'm good at this job," he said. "I mean that without irony. I arrive on time. I do the work carefully. I leave. Rosie knows where I am every day, and I know where she is. That's not nothing." "It's not everything," Victoria said. "No," he agreed. "It's not everything." A long silence settled between them. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It had the quality of a silence in which something important was being decided, and both parties were willing to wait for it. "Yesterday," she said, "in the lobby, what you said about the exposure window. I overstepped," he said, not apologetically, just accurately. "You were right," she said. Our outside counsel gave us the same framework 2 hours later. Slightly, less succinctly. The corner of his mouth moved, almost imperceptibly. "I hope you're going with voluntary disclosure. We're filing next week," she said. He nodded. She stood up. She had meetings beginning in 20 minutes. She picked up her coffee and walked to the door. Then she stopped. "The Bauman Group is looking at a fintech acquisition in the spring," she said. "They've asked me to recommend someone for operational due diligence. Someone meticulous. Someone who has done it before, without drama, at the highest level." She didn't look back at him. "I won't recommend anyone who isn't willing to be recommended," she said. "That would be a waste of both our time." She walked out. For 2 weeks, nothing appeared to change. Nathan came to work. He cleaned the floors and the kitchens and the glass partitions. He coordinated with the building safety team on a ventilation inspection. He dropped Rosie at school and picked her up and read marine biology books, and was quizzed about the migratory habits of humpback whales. Victoria prepared for the board meeting, and managed the Meridian disclosure and took a call with the Bauman Group's principal, a composed 60-year-old German investor named Klaus Baumann, who spoke English with academic precision and had a reputation for knowing, within the first 10 minutes of a conversation, whether the person on the other end was telling him the truth. She did not bring up Nathan Hale in that call. She did, however, think about him during it. This was inconvenient. She thought about the 40 minutes in the kitchen, the way he had spoken without notes and without visible emotion, and the specific quality of his precision, not the precision of someone reciting a rehearsed account, but the precision of someone for whom the facts were simply organized, clearly labeled, stored in the same meticulous order he applied to everything. She thought about the documents he had kept, the decision not to use them. She had known people who made noble decisions and spent the rest of their lives mentioning it. Nathan had made one of the larger sacrifices she could imagine in a professional context the sacrifice of vindication, of the public correction of a false record, and apparently never spoken about it to anyone. Not because he had suppressed it, because he had decided it wasn't the most important thing. She found this quietly extraordinary. Then Clifford Hurst arrived. He had not been part of Victoria's world until the week his name appeared in a filing on her desk, not a lawsuit this time, but a disclosure document related to a prospective acquisition in which one of Callaway Capital's portfolio companies was the target. Hurst was listed as a minority stakeholder in the acquiring entity. Victoria read the disclosure twice. Then she had Diane pull everything available on Hurst's current activities. What came back was not reassuring. Clifford Hurst had spent the years since Harbridge's acquisition accumulating a quietly diversified set of interests in financial services companies, several of which had come under regulatory scrutiny for practices that were, in the words of one trade publication, in tension with fiduciary standards. He had also, according to a source in her network, been conducting back-channel communications with Meridian's founders in the weeks before the SEC inquiry was opened. The timing was not provably causal. It was nonetheless notable. Victoria called her attorney at 7:30 in the morning. She called her head of portfolio risk at 8. By 9, she had a clearer picture of what was happening. Hurst was attempting a coordinated pressure campaign on two of her holdings simultaneously, using regulatory uncertainty to depress valuations and position a connected entity to acquire at reduced price. It was not unprecedented. It was not even particularly sophisticated. But it was effective because it operated in the space between provable and deniable, where most people stopped applying pressure. Victoria was not most people. She spent the afternoon pulling thread after thread, building a picture that was not yet complete but had enough shape to show its intention. Hurst had done this before, not to her, not in her sector, but the pattern was recognizable to anyone who had spent enough time watching how power moved when it stopped being subtle. He manufactured uncertainty, then offered to resolve it. He was, she thought, the particular kind of dangerous that came from being just smart enough and entirely without scruple. She also understood, looking at his timeline, why Nathan had refused to fight him in court. Not because Nathan couldn't have won the documents he had described, made that increasingly clear, but because fighting him would have meant staying in the arena, staying visible, giving Hurst continued access to his calendar, his name, his daughter's sense of whether the world was stable. The cost of winning could be, in the right circumstances, indistinguishable from the cost of losing. At 10 o'clock, she walked to the 42nd floor kitchen. Nathan was there. She closed the door behind her. "Clifford Hurst," she said. The stillness that came over him was different from his ordinary stillness. This was the stillness of a man who had spent years preparing for a word to arrive, and finding, now that it had, that he was ready. "Tell me everything," she said. "All of it," he told her. It took 40 minutes. He spoke without notes, which she had expected, and without visible emotion, which she had also expected. He described the acquisition, the transition period, the moment he had first understood that Hurst's lawsuit was not about the alleged misconduct but about something else: leverage, humiliation, the particular cruelty of a man who could not tolerate having been outperformed. He described the 14 months of the lawsuit and the year of silence that followed, the job he had taken because it was the most complete form of absence he could construct, without actually leaving the city where Rosie's mother's parents lived. He described the documents he had kept. Victoria looked up. "What documents?" "Communications," he said. "From the transition period." Internal messages that showed Hurst's awareness of the methodology he later claimed I had concealed from him. "I kept copies. I didn't use them during the lawsuit, because using them would have extended the proceedings by years, and I couldn't." He stopped. Edited himself. Rosie was 4. "I couldn't." "You kept them," she said. "I kept them," he said. A pause. "I kept them because I understood, even then, that Hurst was not finished. That the lawsuit was one move, and there would eventually be another. I didn't know what form it would take or when, but I kept the documentation because there is a difference between choosing not to fight and choosing to be defenseless." He looked at her steadily. I was not interested in being defenseless. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside the kitchen window, the December sky was the color of old concrete. Somewhere in the building's service corridor, a cart moved with the soft mechanical complaint of unlubricated wheels, the ordinary texture of a day proceeding normally in all directions. "Can you get them to me today?" she said. "Yes," he said. The meeting with Bauman Group's legal team happened on a Thursday. 10 days later. Victoria sat at the head of the table. Nathan was not in the room. Initially, he was in the waiting area on the 38th floor, wearing a suit that fit with the ease of someone for whom suits had once been daily, and reading because he always had something to read. Diane had passed him in the corridor and come to Victoria's office immediately afterward. "The man in the waiting area," she said, with the careful neutrality of someone who had put significant pieces together and was choosing how much of that process to show. "Is that?" "Yes," Victoria said. Diane returned to her desk and said nothing further. She was exceptionally good at her job. Nathan was brought in at 11. Klaus Baumann, present by video from Frankfurt, studied Nathan for a moment before speaking. He had the particular quality of stillness of a man who had made a career of reading people quickly and accurately, and had long since stopped performing the process. He simply did it. "You're the operational architect of the Harbridge acquisition," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Nathan said. "The Hearst lawsuit. Baseless and dismissed," Nathan said, with the calm precision of a fact. "I have documentation that demonstrates Hearst's knowledge of every practice he subsequently alleged I had concealed. I didn't use it during the proceedings because I prioritized speed over vindication." He paused. "I'm no longer prioritizing speed." Baumann was quiet for a moment. Then he said to Victoria, "You trust this man's judgment." "I trust his methodology," Victoria said, which was not quite the same thing and was, she recognized even as she said it, also not entirely true. She trusted both. The Harbridge due diligence was conducted at a level this industry rarely sees. "The documentation I've reviewed supports everything he's described. And the current situation with Hearst?" Victoria laid out what she had assembled over the previous 10 days, the pattern of his acquisitions, the back-channel communications with Meridian's founders, the timing of the SEC inquiry. Nathan added, at 2 points, specific technical details about Hearst's methodology that she could not have provided herself. He spoke without performance. He identified precisely which elements were speculative and which were documented. He said, "I don't know," twice, clearly and without apology. That last detail, the willingness to say "I don't know" in front of a man whose opinion he needed, impressed Victoria more than anything else in the room. She had sat across from enough people who never admitted uncertainty to understand the discipline it took. The confidence required to say "I don't know" without it, reading as weakness, was rarer than most skills listed on resumes. The Hearst documentation, once reviewed by Baumann's legal counsel, was thorough enough to recommend disclosure to the relevant regulatory body. Not as an accusation, Nathan had been precise about that from the beginning. As a correction to the record, the difference was not semantic. It changed the posture from aggression to accuracy, which was a more defensible and considerably more effective position. Gerald Schiff, Callaway Capital's compliance officer, who had been copied on the relevant documentation and had spent 48 hours reviewing it with the outside counsel team, sent Victoria a 2-line message that morning. "This is unusually well-organized work. Whoever put this together was operating at a different level than I expected." She had read it twice and considered forwarding it to Nathan before deciding it was not her message to share. He would do good work because he did good work. He didn't need her narrating it back to him. Afterward, Baumann said, "I'd like to retain you as independent due diligence counsel for the spring acquisition, Mr. Hale. We'll have a proper contract prepared." Nathan was quiet for a moment. Victoria watched him. She recognized the quality of the pause. It was not hesitation. It was the final checking of a calculation that had already been completed, confirming the answer before committing to it. "I'd like to understand the scope first," Nathan said. Baumann almost smiled. "Of course." After the call ended, after the attorneys had gathered their materials, and Diane had efficiently escorted everyone to the appropriate elevator banks, Victoria and Nathan were left alone in the conference room. The table between them was large enough to seat 20. The city was visible on three sides, dense and indifferent under a white winter sky. "You could have used those documents 3 years ago," she said. "Yes," he said, "and instead you chose 11 months of early mornings in a building full of people who never once asked your name." He considered that. "I didn't choose it as a punishment," he said. "I chose it as a boundary. There's a difference." She understood the distinction precisely. A punishment was backward-facing it, answered something that had already happened. A boundary was forward-facing. It defined the shape of what came next. He had drawn one, and he had held it, and now he was on the other side of it. "One condition," he said. She looked at him. "Flexible hours. I drop Rosie at school, and I pick her up. Any engagement that requires otherwise gets restructured." "That's not a condition," Victoria said. "That's a scheduling parameter." "Then we agree," he said. She picked up her portfolio from the table. "We agree." It was a January day, 3 weeks after the Bauman meeting. The kind of morning that arrived already fully committed to being cold. The lake, a flat silver sheet visible from the 42nd floor. Victoria was in the kitchen at 8:15. She was making coffee, operating the machine herself, which she had done more often lately, though she had not examined why. She heard the door and looked up. Nathan was in the doorway. He was wearing the maintenance uniform. Still, he was working out his notice with the building management company. A process that had taken longer than expected and was almost complete. He carried a mop and was clearly in the middle of his morning floor round. He looked at the coffee she was making and said, "You're tamping wrong." She looked at the machine. "I'm tamping correctly. The angle's off. You're getting uneven extraction." She stood back marginally and he came over, adjusted the portafilter, and tamped it with the same pressure she had watched him use that first Tuesday in November. The machine produced a slightly different sound than it usually did with her handling. The coffee that came out was perceptibly better. She looked at it, then at him. "You've been correcting my technique for weeks, and you're only telling me now?" "I was being polite," he said. "I don't need polite." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm telling you now." She handed him a cup. He took it, which he had never done before in this kitchen, never stayed. Never accepted the small domestic courtesy of a shared morning drink. He stood beside the counter and drank and looked at the window and the cold city beyond it. "Rosie asked what my new job was going to be," he said. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I was going to help people figure out if their decisions were sound," he said. "She told me that sounded like what she did when she decided whether to get a hamster." A pause. "She concluded the decision was sound." "I told her we'd revisit in the spring." Victoria looked at the window. The light was pale and particular. The kind that clarified rather than illuminated the world exactly as it was. With no atmospheric flattery. She had been thinking, in the weeks since the Bauman meeting, about the specific character of her initial impressions of this building, this floor, the gray uniformed figures that moved through its periphery, about all the spaces she had moved through in her life with the efficient, purposeful blindness of someone who had decided what was relevant and what wasn't. About what it cost to be certain. She had also been thinking about a man who had possessed the knowledge and the credential and the track record to walk back into the world that had cost him nearly nothing, and had chosen, instead, to build something quiet and stable and completely his, for a 7-year-old who wanted to study humpback whales. There was a version of that choice she had spent her entire career refusing to make. She didn't think it was the wrong choice for her. She was less certain now that it was the wrong choice for him. "The Bauman engagement starts February 15th, she said. "I know," he said. "There's a preparatory meeting in New York on the 12th. You'd need to be available. I'll arrange coverage for Rosie." She nodded, finished her coffee. She was about to move toward the door when she stopped, not because she had something else to say, but because there was a quality to the moment that she found herself, unusually, unwilling to abbreviate. "That first morning," she said, "the espresso, yes, you knew exactly what you were doing." He considered this with the same measured honesty he brought to everything. "I knew how to make coffee," he said. I didn't know what came after. Neither did I, she said. She walked out into the corridor. The floor was clean and quiet, the city light arriving in long, pale planes through the glass. Somewhere in the building below, Diane was arriving for the day. In 7 hours, a conference call with the Hargrove attorneys would finalize the Meridian disclosure strategy. In 6 weeks, Nathan Hale would sit across a table in a Manhattan conference room and perform the kind of methodical, unsparing analysis that had once helped build a $340 million acquisition, and he would be exactly as good at it as he had always been. She paused at the window at the end of the corridor. The lake was visible from here on clear days. Today was not entirely clear. A low gray shelf of cloud sat over the water, the kind that gave Chicago its particular winter quality of compressed sky. Everything pushed down and dense and intimate. She had always liked it. The city was more itself in winter, less interested in performing. She thought about something Nathan had said in the conference room, almost in passing. I didn't choose it as a punishment. I chose it as a boundary. She had turned the sentence over several times since, the way you turned a stone to look at its underside. It had the quality of something true, in a way that extended beyond his specific situation, something applicable to more than one kind of decision. In more than one kind of life, she recognized, been drawing her own set of boundaries for years. The canceled dates, the abbreviated personal conversations, the photograph of the skyline rather than of any person. She had drawn these lines with the same deliberate care he had brought to his forward-facing, she had always told herself, about what came next rather than what had been lost. She was less certain now that all of them were as forward-facing as she had believed. Some of them, she suspected, were looking backward at something she had not quite named. This was not the kind of thought she typically had in a corridor at 8:15 in the morning. She walked back toward her office. The building was beginning to fill. Elevators chimed. Voices gathered at the reception desk. Diane's heels clicked with their characteristic precision down the polished corridor, the whole familiar machinery of a working day assembling itself around her, the same way it had assembled itself for 7 years in this building, the same way it had assembled itself, in a quieter version, for a man who had built far larger machines and chosen deliberately, eyes open to 10 smaller ones for a while, until the right morning arrived. And in the morning, on a school run across town, a 7-year-old girl would tell her father something she had read about humpback whales, and he would listen with the full, unhurried attention of a man who had decided, a long time ago, what actually mattered. He would ask the right follow-up question, the one that made her think he was almost as interested as she was. Because after 4 years of library books, he had become genuinely interested. He would drop her at the school gate and watch until she disappeared through the door. And then he would catch the express bus across town and arrive on time. Because he always arrived on time. Not all secrets, it turned out, were things you kept to protect yourself. Some of them were things you kept to protect what you loved most. And some mornings, the right person walks into the right kitchen at the wrong time, and the only thing that changes is everything.